On March 24, 2026, as a multi-warhead ballistic missile tore through Israel's layered air defenses and struck a residential building in one of Tel Aviv's upscale northern neighborhoods, the President of the United States was on Truth Social, declaring that peace negotiations were going very well. A crater still smoking in a civilian street. A social media post moving oil prices by 10% in a matter of hours. That single contradiction captures everything you need to understand about the war now being called the Second Iran War, a conflict where the boundary between battlefield and trading floor has been completely erased, and where the people trapped in between are paying a price that no market correction will ever recover. 4 weeks into the war, the situation had reached a critical inflection point. What began in early March with American and Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure and ballistic missile capability had escalated into something far broader and far more dangerous. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps responded with what it branded Operation True Promise 4, a sustained retaliatory missile campaign aimed at Israeli population centers, American regional bases, and strategic sites across the Middle East. By March 24, the IRGC had launched 78 distinct waves of missile strikes. And these were not directed at remote military outposts. Fully half of those waves targeted the Tel Aviv metropolitan area, a densely packed urban center home to millions of civilians. On paper, the Israeli Defense Forces had made significant progress. The IDF reported destroying or disabling roughly 330 of Iran's estimated 470 ballistic missile launchers. That sounds like a decisive degradation of capability. But the IRGC's ability to sustain 78 waves of attacks revealed the depth of its redundancy. Hardened underground launch facilities, mobile launchers concealed within civilian infrastructure, and decentralized command structures built over decades for precisely this scenario. Israel was destroying launchers, and the missiles kept flying. And the weapons themselves were getting more dangerous. By late March, the IRGC deployed some of its most advanced delivery systems. The Imad, a precision-guided ballistic missile, and the Qadr, fitted with multiple warheads designed to overwhelm interception systems through sheer volume and submunition dispersal. The tactic was to saturate the Iron Dome and David's Sling with more incoming targets than the systems could track, ensuring that enough warheads penetrated to cause real damage. A recovered warhead from the March 24 Tel Aviv strike weighed 100 kilograms. 4 civilians were treated for injuries. A 3-story building was gutted, its surroundings cratered, vehicles around it twisted beyond recognition. But what came next in the broader campaign was far more alarming, and it signals a shift that changes the character of this entire conflict. Reports from the Israeli Home Front Command described cluster munitions detonating over densely populated urban areas. Submunitions struck simultaneously across Ramat Gan, Petah Tikva, and Holon. One hit a kindergarten in Rishon LeZion. Cluster warheads released dozens of smaller explosive devices at a preset altitude, blanketing city blocks with lethal fragmentation. Their deployment over civilian neighborhoods represents a sharp escalation, one that international humanitarian law experts immediately flagged. The IRGC framed these attacks as impact-driven negotiations, a phrase that deserves careful attention because it reveals a doctrine in which inflicting civilian casualties is explicitly positioned as a bargaining instrument. But while Iran was escalating its tactics in the air, Israel was executing something far more calculated on the ground. And this is where the war enters its darkest chapter. Israeli intelligence launched what sources identified as Operation Narnia, a systematic campaign to eliminate the scientists, engineers, and physicists behind Iran's nuclear and missile programs. These were not battlefield commanders. They were academics and researchers, many of whom had spent decades at the core of Iran's defense industrial complex. Saeed Shamgadri, an electrical engineering professor linked to missile and drone development, was killed alongside his own children when his residence was directly struck. Mohammad Mehdi Taranchi, a theoretical physicist central to high-explosive research for nuclear warhead design, was eliminated. Faridun Abbasi Davani, former head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization and a key figure in the covert Ahmad project, the alleged pre-2004 nuclear weapons program, was targeted. Akbar Motalebzadeh, a chemistry specialist who had advised the late Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the architect of Iran's nuclear weapons effort, assassinated in 2020, was also killed. The most strategically devastating loss may have been Ali Bakoui Katarimi, one of only a handful of senior experts in multi-point initiation systems, the precisely timed explosive lenses required to compress fissile material to the point of nuclear criticality. Without that expertise, building an implosion-type nuclear weapon becomes extraordinarily difficult. The logic behind Operation Narnia is stark. Centrifuges can be rebuilt, enrichment facilities reconstructed. But the people who carry the knowledge cannot be replaced within a generation. The coalition aimed to create a vacuum that no amount of funding or concrete could fill. We will come back to what that vacuum means for the future of this war, because it becomes critical later. If this is reshaping the way you think about how modern conflicts are actually fought, drop your perspective in the comments, because these are questions without simple answers, and the conversation around them genuinely matters. Iranian state media and the foreign ministry condemned the killings as terrorist and criminal attacks on civilian residences. International human rights organizations raised urgent alarms. The human rights activists' news agency reported that total Iranian fatalities had surpassed 1,500 by late March, with some estimates as high as 3,230, including more than 200 children. These figures are difficult to verify independently in an active war zone, but the scale of civilian suffering was beyond dispute. Strikes hit targets across 15 Iranian provinces, Isfahan, Tabriz, Bandar Abbas, and beyond, as the IDF expanded its campaign against IRGC command centers and Ministry of Defense production facilities. And here is where the information war became inseparable from the shooting war. President Trump had announced a 5-day pause in strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure, publicly framed as a humanitarian gesture and a window for diplomacy. But reports from Iran's Fars news agency documented strikes on a gas pressure regulation station in Isfahan and a pipeline feeding the Khorramshahr power plant during the supposed pause. The gap between the official American narrative and the tactical reality was glaring. It pointed to a strategy of controlled escalation, maximize internal pressure on the Iranian regime while maintaining the appearance of diplomatic restraint for the benefit of global audiences and, more urgently, global markets. Because the markets were the other battlefield. On March 23rd, Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States was engaged in very good and productive conversations with unnamed senior Iranian figures. He credited his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, as the primary negotiators, suggesting the tenor and tone of discussions warranted the temporary halt. Within hours, oil prices dropped roughly 10%, falling below $100 a barrel for the first time in weeks. Billions in projected energy costs vanished on the strength of a single social media post, while the military reality on the ground had not shifted at all. The Iranian response was swift and categorical. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Speaker of Iran's parliament and a former IRGC commander, posted on X calling Trump's claims fake news. He accused the United States of using psychological warfare to manipulate oil and financial markets and to buy time for military regrouping. The The foreign ministry acknowledged that messages had been received through intermediaries, specifically Oman and Pakistan, but insisted no direct negotiations had taken place. They framed the 5-day pause not as good faith, but as a retreat driven by fear of Iran's retaliatory power. Both narratives served calculated purposes. For the Trump administration, the productive talks framing provided an off-ramp from the extreme threat of obliterating Iran's civilian power grid, an action that could have constituted a war crime. For the Iranian leadership, denying the talks preserved domestic morale and sent a clear message to regional proxy forces that the resistance axis was not bending. The truth likely existed somewhere in the space between the two positions. Messages tested through backchannels, positions probed, nothing formalized, both sides spinning the ambiguity to their advantage. But the most consequential dimension of this conflict was not playing out in the skies above Tel Aviv or the rubble of Tehran's military compounds. It was unfolding in the water. And if you've been following this story closely, subscribing now makes sense, because this situation is shifting by the day, and the global consequences are only compounding. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, through which roughly 1/5 of the world's crude oil and liquefied natural gas normally transits, had been effectively shut down. By March 24th, daily vessel crossings had collapsed from a peacetime average of 80 to 100 ships down to just 2 or 3. The most critical energy corridor on the planet had been converted into a combat zone, and the economic shockwaves were already radiating outward across every major market. The mechanism of closure was deceptively elegant: naval mines. U.S. intelligence confirmed the IRGC had deployed Maham 3 and Maham 7 limpet mines, sophisticated bottom-dwelling devices capable of remote activation. At least a dozen were confirmed active in the strait, though Iran's total mine inventory was estimated at around 2,000. The strategic brilliance of the Maham series lies in their selectivity. They can be programmed to permit the passage of friendly or non-Western linked vessels, so-called zombie ships, while posing a lethal threat to any tanker associated with the United States or its allies. Insurance companies pulled coverage almost immediately. Without insurance, commercial shipping stopped, not because every vessel would hit a mine, but because no corporation on Earth was willing to bear the risk. 21 commercial vessels had been attacked since early March, including the tankers Prima, Mayuri Nari, One Majesty, and Star Gwyneth. At least 8 seafarers and dock workers had been killed. Over 1,650 vessels experienced GPS interference, a 55% increase from pre-war levels. Some captains went dark, switching off automatic identification systems or spoofing their positions to appear in neutral waters. Satellite data detected at least 8 of these ghost transits inside the strait, possibly including very large crude carriers running high-risk voyages under electronic cover. The IRGC's warning was unambiguous. Any vessel ignoring their directives would be set ablaze. Fatih Birol, head of the International Energy Agency, stated publicly that the crisis posed a major threat to the global economy, surpassing the impact of the 1970s oil shocks. The normal relationship between supply and demand fundamentals and market pricing had broken entirely. Fear was now the primary driver of crude above $100 a barrel. As the conflict threatened to pull in more actors, a coalition of secondary powers moved to prevent total catastrophe. Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt, informally known as the STEP Group, emerged as the primary brokers of backchannel diplomacy. Pakistan took the most visible role, leveraging its position as a nuclear-armed state with meaningful ties to both sides. Field Marshal Asim Munir reportedly spoke with Trump on March 22nd. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif called Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian the following day. Pakistan proposed hosting formal negotiations in Islamabad, motivated not only by regional stability, but by the direct economic damage the shipping crisis was already inflicting on South Asian economies, and the Belt and Road Initiative, for which Iran is a key transit corridor. Turkey and Egypt worked complementary channels, passing technical proposals between the warring parties and focusing on the logistics of a ceasefire and the reopening of the strait. Both had urgent self-interest at stake: disrupted trade routes and the growing specter of a refugee crisis if the Iranian state fractured under sustained bombardment. An intriguing subplot emerged around the competition between the Chinese-backed Belt and Road Initiative and the Western-backed India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. While the war generated enormous uncertainty for the BRI, India quietly strengthened its position, continuing to import Iranian oil, operating the strategic Chabahar port, and positioning itself as a viable alternative economic axis, while its rivals were consumed by the fighting. At the United Nations, the Security Council was completely paralyzed. Russia's ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia, described the strikes as a stab in the back, occurring while dialogue was supposedly underway, accusing the US and Israel of pursuing regime change under the cover of non-proliferation. China's ambassador, Fu Kong, focused on civilian casualties, while Beijing successfully evacuated over 3,000 Chinese nationals from Iran. Bahrain, backed by the United States and Gulf states, proposed a resolution authorizing all necessary means to protect shipping in the strait, the standard diplomatic formulation for the use of force. It faced certain vetoes from both Russia and China, leaving the institution designed to manage exactly this kind of crisis entirely sidelined. Despite Trump's repeated assurances that no American ground forces would deploy, the military posture told a more complex story. The positioning of 4,500 Marines and sailors, supported by F-35 aircraft and amphibious assault ships, including the USS Boxer, signaled that contingency plans for securing the strait or raiding suspected nuclear material storage sites remained very much active. The IRGC, for its part, signaled readiness for a multi-year confrontation. Its doctrine of impact-driven strikes, combined with operational control over the strait through mines and drone warfare, designed to impose what Iranian leadership openly called a humiliating punishment on its adversaries. If someone you know needs to understand the full scope of what is happening and why its consequences reach far beyond the Middle East, send this to them, because the ripple effects of this war are touching every economy on the planet. Now, remember the knowledge vacuum created by Operation Narnia, the systematic elimination of Iran's scientific elite? That decision carries consequences extending far beyond the immediate military calculus. It may have set back Iran's nuclear ambitions by a generation. But it also removed some of the most technically pragmatic voices within the regime, people who understood the science well enough to recognize its limits, people who could credibly argue for restraint based on capability assessments rather than ideology. What remains in their absence are the hardliners, the ideologues, the IRGC commanders whose identities are built around escalation. On the American side, the dynamic runs parallel. The political imperative to project strength, to never be seen backing down, generates its own momentum toward deeper confrontation. The global economy remains captive to a waterway that has become more minefield than shipping lane, controlled by a regime that has learned to weaponize the price of oil with the same precision it applies to its most advanced missiles. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer simply a geographic choke point. It is the single most volatile variable in the global economic system, and neither side has any incentive to defuse it. This war will not end with one diplomatic breakthrough or a single decisive strike. The most probable trajectory is a grinding war of attrition. Periodic pauses engineered for market stabilization, punctuated by devastating exchanges of firepower, all layered beneath a relentless information war, where what is said carries as much weight as what is done. The question is no longer whether this conflict will reshape the Middle East. That has already happened. The question is how far the damage radiates across energy markets, across alliance structures, across the global order itself, before someone on either side finally concludes that the cost of peace is lower than the cost of one more wave.